This episode is not sponsored by Murphy's USA.
All right, and welcome back to They Live by Film, a platform dedicated to film discussion from around the world. I am Zach Bryant. Adam is still missing, but with me is Chris. It's just going to be me and him. We could not convince anyone to watch these three films with us. So, how are you doing today, Chris?
I'm good, man. How are you?
Not too bad, not too bad. A little late, which where you're at, it's what, like an hour? You're an hour?
I've got an hour on you. Yeah, so it's only
Yeah.
8:30 for me.
Yeah. So not nothing different than usual.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes.
Right.
The same
But I
time zone
am
as usual.
same time zone, but quite a different state. So this episode is brought to you by the city of El Dorado, Arkansas. How far do you have to drive to get to a Walmart?
For me, I live like 6 minutes from one.
Okay. Is it like one of the like the super Walmarts or one of the like larger ones?
Yeah, it's a super center.
So they have there's a good chance they have a Murphy gas station in front of it?
You are correct, yes.
So that they're headquartered in El Dorado, Arkansas. I'm here for business.
Oh man, do you think you get me a discount like buy gas tomorrow?
Sure, I'll ask them. Sure.
Yeah, just like go across the street and say, hey, I need a little bit of a discount. Friend of
Yeah.
the podcast, Murphy USA.
See if we can get them to sponsor us. Um,
If you hear sponsors begin of this, you know we were successful. If you did not, they are no longer friends of the podcast.
we'll have to try to make a jingle for them.
Well, what have you been watching, man? I know sounds like you've been traveling a bit. So have you got a chance to watch anything besides Von Trier?
I have been traveling a little bit. You're right. I mentioned last time that there's somebody I found that has basically been like really good at helping me um, find things to watch. So I wanna call her out by name. Her name's Holly. She lives in Australia. So Holly, if you're listening, thank you for always having great movie conversations. And um, uh, she
And you
we
can listen to this episode because Adam isn't here to insult Australians.
That's right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, it's super fun to find a like-minded person. Everything she's recommended so far has been 10 out of 10. And it was fun to watch. So for I can't remember the reason I watched it now, but was it for the film club or for some reason I ended up watching In the Realm of the Senses finally. I finally got a chance to watch it. Have you seen that yet?
I've never even heard of it until you just said it.
That was a wild movie to talk about with her because that movie is erotic as hell. Um, like it's basically the plot of the movie is just like these two people. One is like I guess she's kind of like a courtesan type, and then the guy who sort of frequents the the brothel or whatever. Um, they just sort of develop this like very obsessive, lustful relationship. I mean, you can certainly call it love, but like the point of it is like lust. And the movie is about an hour and 40 minutes long, and over the course of that, it just becomes like the it just becomes more and more obsessive. And I don't want to spoil it, but it just sort of kind of like Lars von Trier that we've been talking about. It sort of follows this passion through to like the logical conclusion of like how far could a relationship based purely on like carnal pleasure go. Um, Fascinating film. There's a there's obviously a lot of nudity in the film, but I would say it's like kind of like covered up a bit in some ways. But more than anything, it's just like the whole movie is just like dripping with uh, lust. But a fascinating movie, Japanese movie from the 70s. Um,
And it's called In the Realm of the Senses.
yeah,
Okay. Yeah, it's NC-17, so that's Interesting,
Yeah.
because the year it was made, NC-17 didn't exist, so they went back and re-rated this, which is fascinating to me.
Yeah, I mean it definitely fits the definition of an NC-17. I would say it's not quite along to the level of like an X-rated movie, so that rating probably makes sense. Um, but it's not far away from it. Um, what else did I watch that wasn't Lars von Trier? Kung Fu Panda 4. I don't know which on the other end of the spectrum from um, one of the most erotic movies I've ever watched. Is Kung
How
Fu.
was it?
I don't get all the hate for Kung Fu Panda, man. Like, I mean, 4 specifically. There's like
I would say I
people.
think people like the first one, don't they?
Yeah, yeah, no, no.
Yeah.
The first, but like Kung Fu, I think it's maybe people watching it without kids, and maybe they're saying like it's not as funny as I don't know. It's fine though, man. Like, these movies are all pretty consistent. Like, you just get Jack Black to be Jack Black for 2 hours or hour and a half or whatever, and put some characters around him. And I know you can't do pure like improv in an animated movie, but I have to imagine that some of that is improv on some level, just being Jack Black. But yeah, they're fun, man. They're fun. They, I,
I have only seen, I think, the first two. I have not seen three, and I have not seen four, but I
I
should
think
make.
it's a hot take. Maybe I don't know if it's a hot take anymore, but the studio that does these Kung Fu Panda movies are like they do like Crudes and they do like the one about the dragon, like Toothless the dragon.
Yeah, How to Train Your Dragon,
How to Train
DreamWorks.
Your Yeah, is it DreamWorks? Is that right? Isn't that
Yeah,
the they're better than they're making better stuff than Disney right now, man.
I don't know if you've seen the trailer for. You may have. Did you go see this in theaters? Did you see it like on a plane or?
No,
uh
just at home.
I was going to say if you got to see it in theaters, you may have got a trailer for the Wild Robots, which my girlfriend has like got me to watch like several times.
The
It
trailer.
looks really good. It has very nice looking animation, which everything's kind of going at least their own inspiration towards like Spider Verse now, which is like this mix of like 2D, 3D thing, which I think looks nice. I'm a fan of it, but you should check out that one. Owen might be interested in that, so
Yeah,
it
I'm
might
just
make
looking
him
it up right now.
it might depress him. It might be my generation's like Iron Giant, where you just get devastated.
I really like Lupita Nyong'o,
I do
the
too.
actress. The little bit I've seen her and she's been awesome. I guess she's not. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought she was directing it. She's an actor in it. Okay, that makes sense. Oh, Pedro Pascal as well.
Yeah, and the trailer doesn't show like any voice acting, so I'm really curious about that. They've made it, I don't know, like maybe kind of Wally-ish, where they kind of don't focus on like the voice acting. They're just like, here's the visuals, here's how pretty it looks, this is the story, but without the dialogue stuff going on.
Man, yeah, I'm just looking at this now. I know this is a huge tangent if we're trying to get to Lars von Trier here in a minute, but this reminds me when you said Wally. I don't think there's ever been a run like peak Pixar when it comes to animated movies.
Oh yeah,
Maybe
from like Toy Story up to I would say I guess Wally came out what, 08?
I'm just going to look it up right now.
Yeah,
Right
I mean
now,
the only
Pixar
thing
basic. Hmm?
I should say, I think the only dud they may have had was maybe like Cars, which is fine. The Cars isn't bad.
No, the first Cars was awesome, man. I mean, I thought so.
Yeah,
It,
I mean, it's just if it would be like a pretty decent movie, but compared it to the rest of that run, you're like, it's much weaker than the rest of the run in Pixar, in my
so
opinion.
yeah, yeah, that's fair. So Toy Story, Bugs Life, and Toy Story 2 were all, I would say, good. But then Monsters Inc. for me was when I was like, okay, I'm paying attention. And then Finding Nemo, Incredibles, Ratatouille, Wally, Up. So 2009. So 2001 to 2009, that 8 year run for me. Cars was also in there, but maybe it's Brad Bird's influence. I don't know, but that was just like, man, every single thing they did was a smash, classic.
Yeah, and I mean Brad Bird, I mentioned Iron Giant. I mean he had a lot of
Yeah,
experience even outside of it, which I think is great.
yeah. Another Simpsons alum.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. Yeah, yeah.
Did you what did you think? For me, Inside Out is the best thing they've done. What's your favorite one overall?
Like, if we're gonna do recent,
Yeah,
Coco is probably my favorite recent Pixar movie.
Coco's good.
Overall, let me think. Probably Wally. It's probably got to be Wally.
Dude, Wally's so good.
Yeah, like, and I mean, I would have been okay with the whole movie being almost like a silent film, like with how good they do like the first 30, 40 minutes of that movie. I was like, that's how you can convince like young kids to be okay with silent films.
Yeah, true. Yeah, that
Because
cute little cockroach.
yeah, and I mean, it's very enthralling, and I'm so glad that they had like a studio that was willing to believe in it, because there's a lot of studios that say you've got to add some dialogue into this first 40 minutes because kids are going to get bored.
Yeah,
So
true.
it takes a lot of trust, and I think it paid off. I think Wally's great, and it ended up in the Criterion, which I haven't bought, but
Yeah,
it's there now.
true, true. What about you, man? What have you been watching?
I have not been watching much at all. So during the week since we last recorded, the Fallout TV show came out, and me and my girlfriend binged that. It's like 8 episodes long on Prime, and since then I have put like 18 hours into Fallout 4 again since like this week alone, which has not left me a lot of time to watch movies. The only movie I can think of I went to see was the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, the new Guy Ritchie movie. We went to see that in theaters, which was good. It's I'm really digging like post Aladdin Guy Ritchie. I kind of like it better than his pre Aladdin stuff. Like I know Snatch is a very popular one. It's Sherlock Holmes stuff, Lock Stock. But I don't know. I've really been into like Wrath of Man and The Gentleman and stuff like this. I don't know. He's got this sense of fun that I think you don't see as much like from these big directors who get these like pretty decent sized budgets. So I'm a fan. I hope he keeps making stuff like that yearly, where he just kind of does these like high medium budget movies that have good action in them. And
Well, he's kind of carrying the torch for all these action movies that came out in the 90s, right?
yeah, and I mean he has his own modern flair to it. He's his dialogue's always been quippy. It's always been quick, which I think fits more of a modern
Sure.
day sort of thing. But yeah, I think it's your 90s action movies. And I think I don't know, it's hard when you're on one app like Letterbox and you start reading reviews, and I just kind of get to the point where I'm like, what did you expect when you saw the trailer for this? Like, what was your expectation?
Yeah.
Like, pulpy is not something Letterbox does very well, like pulpy or schlocky or
That's
just a fun
true.
romp. They just kind of struggle. Like, a lot of the user base seems to struggle with that idea because it's not quote unquote high art. Um, but I don't know. I think a lot of people's favorite movies aren't necessarily high art. They're fun and they're entertaining, and they
Well,
don't try to be more than that.
I remember going online and reading reviews because I had a good time with Wrath of Man. I was like, damn, people hated that.
And I could, and I'll be, my hot take is it's my favorite Guy Ritchie movie. I think it is one of like the best heist movies I've seen in quite a long time.
Yeah,
Like,
okay,
I think it's
good.
so good. It's his Heat. It's his version of Heat.
Okay,
And
okay.
to me, that's what it kind of came to. It was really dark for him. Not to get too much, because we do have to talk about Lars, but like, Scott Eastwood has been kind of a guy I've had a hard time with, like from a performance standpoint. And I think he did so well in Wrath of Man because he's supposed to be like this superficial, charismatic guy. He's a guy pretending to be charming, where every other movie has said, just be your dad. And it's like, he's not that. And I think him almost playing like a psychopath character kind of fits him surprisingly well.
Yeah, well, it's good. I'm glad you liked it as well then, because yeah, I remember feeling like, oh, that movie was kind of fun. Like, it's a good little genre flick, and then people just did not like it.
Oh, my girlfriend must have been hearing me. She wanted me to note that we did go see Shrek in theaters. So I should have brought that up when we were talking about DreamWorks. We saw Shrek 2.
Sure. Oh, okay. It was like a re-release kind of, or just like a one night kind of thing.
It was a re-release for the week. They do that. I know it's for a lot of kids movies. They're actually going to be re-showing Brandon Fraser's The Mummy on Friday. So I know we're
Uh,
going to go see that.
those are fun, man. Those are
Yeah.
Shrek, like that was a fun time in entertainment. It was like Ice Age and Shrek. I don't know. There's some good movies going on.
Me and Alicia, she threw on Ice Age not long ago, and I was like, man, the animation on this looks so trashy, and it looks terribly and cheap. But that movie is still so funny. It is carried by like the writing, as weird as that is to say, it's carried by it. It's so much fun to watch. You can really ignore the really ugly animation.
Well, okay, maybe last point because I know we have to talk about something a little bit that's not this, but you know, when Owen was small, right? We were like, okay, let's put on some, let's put on some Disney movies or whatever, right? And dude, all these Disney movies are like sad and like the mom dies or like the dad gets trampled by a wildebeest or like it's just like what the fuck, man? So Ice Age was nice because it was just like the stakes are never that high. It's just a fun little silly animated movie and like that little squirrel's trying to get his nut, like it was just like not so dramatic. It was so refreshing.
And I've compared it a lot. Like I have a huge annoyance. You know how a lot of people hate like the minions? I hate Olaf from Frozen like a lot. I really, really hate that snowman. And I always say it's because it's trying to be Sid from Ice Age, but in a much more annoying way.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah,
Is he your Jar Jar Binks?
he feels that way. Yeah, but it's how it is. Like I'm like, oh, every time it's on, I'm like, oh no, it's Olaf. Just please melt, please melt. But
Funny.
all right, I think we've gotten a little bit of it for anyone who needed this. When we're talking about Lars, we have to like talk about happy kids movies before we just like delve
Yeah,
on in.
yeah,
So
exactly.
I guess with that, we're going to talk about our first film, which I think I actually already have it up on. No, I didn't because I'm looking at it in the realm of senses. So I have to go back. For our first film, we're going to be talking about Dogville. And I will get you. Which did you know this while I'm pulling this up? Did you know there was like a TV show pilot for this? I don't know if this was something we're going to take up, but when I was looking through his filmography, it was like Dogville, the pilot, and I'm like, what? That wasn't in my set.
I saw that was listed on IMDb, but I didn't know what that was about. Yeah.
But
Um,
so I guess I'll set the stage. So this is 3 years after Dancer in the Dark, which last week was a very pro episode. I think we were a little bit mixed on the idiots, but I think Breaking the Waves and um, Dancer in the Dark was very positive.
yeah.
So this is 3 years after that little bit of run for him, where we're going to talk about Dogville, which stars Nicole Kidman. A woman on the run from the mob is reluctantly accepted into a small Colorado community in exchange for labor. But when the search visits the town, she finds out that their support has a price. So we will, if you would like to get us started, Chris, on like where this ranks. I wish I could remember. It's been a while since we recorded, and I can't exactly remember where his other stuff was last week.
It's okay. So a lot of his movies are going to be in the top 2000 of all time. There's a few exceptions to that. But people, critics really like Lars von Trier. And by the way, I listened to a ton of special features because I just went down a little bit of a rabbit hole on Dogville. And it is 100% von Trier, not von Trier.
Von Trier. Okay. I
Yeah.
will try to Trier. Okay. I will
No,
try to
it
get that
doesn't.
correct.
Not that it matters, I think a ton, but we have to give it to Celeste, who has was correct in that last time. Um,
Which do I have to? I mean, Vaughn isn't even his real name, so like, I feel like I can mispronounce it when he just adds stuff to his name that doesn't exist.
yeah, exactly. That's true, actually. Um, okay, so it is this particular one is the 416th best movie of all time.
Wow, I like this movie, but that's high. That's higher than I expected, to be
Yeah.
honest.
It was a pretty rapid ascent on the They Shoot Pictures list. So it joined the list in 2013 and it joined it at 642 and it's been up as high as 362 and now it's at
Wow.
416. Um,
So, what are your thoughts? Do you think it deserves to be that high up?
all right. So there's one thing I want to say before I answer very directly, and I will. These movies we're talking about today, other than the Five Obstructions, were a planned trilogy for him. There's a third script that's written. So Dogville, Manderlay, and then the third one is going to be called George Washington. They were all going to have character grace. and she represents this, obviously, this gangster's daughter, and they were all going to be her stories of her going across America at this transitional point in history, in American history. Um, I I kind of wish he had stopped at Dogville. I think this is almost a perfect movie.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get to Manderlay because, to spoil it a little bit, I think one of the issues I'm going to bring up a lot with Manderlay is it's almost like he didn't know how to recreate what he did with Dogville.
I I think we're gonna share some opinions on that. But yeah, for this one, I think he captured magic in a bottle. So I think it's, well, before I get into all of the setup and all that stuff, I love this a lot. I don't know, it's gonna be tough to figure out which is my favorite Von Trier movie, but this is certainly gonna be up there. So what did you think?
I, you know, I mentioned earlier when we were going through what I'd watched lately that I haven't watched many movies, and I actually haven't really been in the mood to watch many here lately, just because I'm in a rare gaming mood and I've just been spamming that. So when I went to watch Dogville, I was just like, I do not really feel like watching a movie. This one's 3 hours long. I am just not in the mood. And it's fascinating how quickly like it captures my attention. And I had no problem watching it for the 3 hours. I had no, and he's Von Trier is very good at opening opening up something or getting you intrigued.
Yes.
I will say that's something I've noticed through all of these. Like, even if I'm like, that doesn't sound that interesting, more times than not, I'm intrigued by the first few minutes and I will continue watching, even if the premise doesn't really sound like my thing. And this one's really no exception, Of course, we'll talk about this. It's all set up as almost a stage play. So, when you're doing that overhead shot and you're looking at like just these outlines and you see people walking, and you're sitting there like, oh, that's a cool way to open the movie up. And you're thinking, okay, this is going to move to like a more traditional set. And it just commits and it never does. And it leaves you on that sound stage.
Yeah.
Uh, and, these people are pretending to, that the dog is there. They're pretending that the bushes are there or anything else. And, we'll get into a lot of what I think it does well. But I think there is something so intriguing about Dogville. It didn't like end up beating some of the ones that I've had really high up, like Breaking the Waves or Dancer in the Dark or Europa, but it's like right behind those.
So there's something that I noticed, and we're going to talk about this more when we talk about the Five Obstructions. There's something that I noticed about Von Trier watching that helped me see the rest of his movies kind of in almost starting with Dogville, kind of in a different light, and even going back to some of his earlier movies too. But I think he's a guy that is an extremely intellectual person, and I don't mean he's smart, although it seems like he is also very smart. But I think he's somebody that likes to challenge himself intellectually and like try to make something work, just for the sake of trying it. Like, he had this idea, what if we shot a whole movie on a soundstage and the houses that people inhabit are just going to be outlined in chalk. There's no three dimensions. Some of them have furniture that they sit on and those things, but it's essentially a two-dimensional movie, not a three-dimensional movie, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's almost like I was thinking while I was watching it, it almost feels like the opposite of like Dogma 95, where you're trying to get like to make something look so much like a real movie with the most minimal amount you can with all these restrictions. Where this one is, he doesn't really have a financial restriction here or a restriction in that sense, but he almost like forces one, saying the acting is, I'm relying on them to carry this as far as they can take it. Like it's almost like it deconstructs what a movie is.
Yeah.
Like and it's like and for all it seems like one of those things where you make it and you're like, if nobody's interested in this, well, I tried. We know. But at the same time, if you're successful, then you kind of question what makes a good movie. Like, is it like what actually makes that intriguing? Because you're given such a minimal look. The backgrounds are almost always black or white. Um, you don't have many props, and you just have actors who are given pretty good performances across the board. So it's very fascinating to see such a minimal movie put in almost the opposite of what minimalism was supposed to look like.
Yeah. I I think you're doing a great job of capturing what caught my attention about this. The only thing I want to add was he made an interesting choice of having a very pleasant, almost Wes Anderson style narration over this as well.
But you had John Hurt. You can't go wrong with that.
John Hurt, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's a
And
great choice for narrator.
and I was just thinking because I had seen this before. I saw it when it was in theaters back in 2003, but I hadn't seen it since, and I don't remember the narrator as well. Um, but that's such a brilliant choice because it kind of the whole thing has this like kind of folklore style feel to it, right? Like it's almost like when the movie starts off, it almost feels like you're going into like a Mary Poppins type story or like one of these kind of like these classic, regional family tales or fairy tales or something about, about this made up land of Dogville.
Yeah,
Uh,
and to me, it also has like this novelistic element to it too. You have somebody who's going through as this like omniscient narrator. And sometimes I was sitting there thinking, like, this is how I sometimes read a book. This is kind of what I see. I don't build everything in my mind because I just don't have that inventiveness when I read. This is kind of more of what I see when I read a book. Characters almost in like this voidish type of thing going on.
oh, okay, yeah. Like hyper focused on, because it becomes hyper focused on whatever they're doing at that moment. They're not really, you don't focus on the outer world as much. Like you become very focused on just them, right?
Yeah, and it's almost like that's really all that exists.
Yes, yes. So the basic premise, I guess, just quickly, is that Nicole Kidman plays someone named Grace. We there's oh, I guess we should say it's broken up into 9 chapters, right?
With Yeah, and I can't remember all the chapters. I wish I'd wrote them down. The funniest names for chapters I've seen in like a movie. It's not at all trying to be artful. It literally just tells you what happens in the chapter.
Yeah, exactly.
Like I think the last one is something something and the movie ends.
Yeah, exactly,
And that's
exactly,
and that's it.
exactly. And I think they say 9 chapters in a prologue, right?
Yes,
And so
yes.
the prologue is like meeting this Dogville town and meeting the inhabitants, and then out of nowhere, this woman comes in who seems lost and seems like she's being chased, and they hide her out in the local like a mine. And the people that are chasing her, they tell them to move on, and then the town meets and decides to give her. Is it 48 hours or is it 2 weeks? Is it 2 weeks?
Yeah, 2 weeks.
2 weeks to kind of prove herself and figure out if they're going to turn her in or if she can become part of the community, right?
Yes.
And she wins them over, and so now she then becomes a part of this like this kind of mountainous style community. Um, and then things start to fall apart at some point in the way that Von Trier likes to do. But the first half of the movie or so is pretty optimistic. She's a very cheerful, kind, like warm-hearted, kind of caring person, right?
Yeah, and I mean, and I think Nicole, like that's something we'll talk about later. With I think she captures what could be a pretty annoying character if not done pretty well because of like I don't know. I think she it gets summed up well at the end of her arrogance, like without spoiling too much. But I do think there's like an air of that throughout that I think she doesn't let go too far, like so the audience still is like rooting for her throughout the whole thing because she gets the rough end of the stick in this movie.
Yeah. Well, we see an example in the third movie we're going to talk about, I think of with all due respect, of a lesser actor who it does not handle it with the same balance. The movie is quite different without it. Um, or at least, maybe the material's better here. I don't know, but I think Nicole Kidman nails this role. Um, Vision from the Marvel movies plays Thomas Edison,
which,
and
which is a fascinating name. And I wanted to know, like, I'm trying to figure out what the choice of the name is, because obviously you're using it like a famous inventor. Like, this isn't like some niche you're just putting in. You're like, okay, he has the same name. Why?
Yeah, I definitely want to get into that because I have no idea and it was driving me crazy. Um, but there's a few other things he does from a casting perspective that I want to kind of ask about because he brings Lauren Bacall in, classic old Hollywood, right?
Mm-hmm.
He brings Harriet Anderson in, classic, um, one of the four like kind of huge female actors from Bergman days. James Caan has a role. Ben Gazzara has a role. Freaking Philip Baker Hall. Like the cast for this movie is unreal.
And you can't forget Udo. It is a Lars movie,
Udo Kier, of course.
of course, and
Yeah.
Skellen Skarsgård's in this one too.
Stellan Skarsgård. Where is he?
He is the oh, what's his name in it? He's like the guy who doesn't like her at first because the dog doesn't like her.
Oh, that is Stellan Skarsgård. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. You're
See,
right.
and I always note it because I always joke with my girlfriend. This is a tangent, but I'll make it quick. You've seen the three Pirates of the Caribbean movies, right? The first three.
Yeah.
So there's that part in the first one where they're always like Orlando Bloom as a spitting image of Bootstrap Bill, and of course, we don't see the character Bootstrap Bill is played by Stellan Skarsgård until the second. And I'm like, look, it's just a spitting image of Orlando Bloom every time I see him.
That's pretty good, actually. Um, yeah. So that's kind of like what happens in the movie. Now, the themes of this movie, I think, is where it starts to get interesting. So we, uh, I mean, there's 9 chapters, but if we kind of break it into like 2 parts, essentially the arc of this movie is that things start to go well, and then they really fall apart, right?
Yeah, and it falls apart. I was actually like my this is another thing. My girlfriend was in the living room reading, and she said every time she looked up, something else wild was happening. Like she'd look up for a minute, like, how did we get here? Because there'd be like these things that would happen. She'd look down, then she'd look up, and suddenly they're like breaking her like little figurines, and she'd be like, "What is going on?
Yeah,
Like, when did this happen?"
yeah. Well, so I want to see if we can land at like what he was trying to say. Maybe you already know, but the thing that caught my attention is that like, there's this old stereotype if you're from the South of people are nice on the surface but rotten on the inside, right?
Yeah, it's the old bless her heart sort of idea. That sounds like a nice phrase, but it's actually like an insult.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's always another layer. That there's a lot of bitterness in these little small communities, but everybody's always nice to each other. Um, so it becomes difficult for somebody from the north, in this case, to like fully settle in and become family with them because she's always going to be an outsider. Um, I guess I'm trying to think if there's like one question here because I have like a million questions to kind of work through. But as the movie ended, before we get into spoilers, although I think we certainly should, but when the movie ended and rolled, I'm trying to figure out what is Von Trier trying to do with this movie and this trilogy, because like he chose a small mountainous town in America, a country he's never been to, and he can't go to because he has a fear of flying. So he only knows about America from like books and stories and movies and right? Like he's got this sort of outsider in perspective on America. He sort of captures the stereotype of a small rural mountainous town in America, right? But I think it stays at that stereotypical level. It doesn't really go deeper. The characters don't have a lot of depth, really. I don't think, and I think that's even by design. I don't think he's trying to give them a lot of depth. I think they're there for a particular reason, which is to drag this poor woman through hell.
Yeah, and especially like when you look at like Paul Bettany's character, Tom, he's a guy who perceives himself as having a lot of depth when he's doesn't really at all.
Yeah, he
Like
does.
he sees himself as, as an educational type, as a intellect, when he really has nothing above anybody else in that town beyond that he feels better about himself.
Well, and his dad's a doctor who's a hypochondriac, right?
Yeah. So yeah, and it's little things like that, like trying to debate how much we go through. Basically, it gets to the point, where we're kind of hinting at where horrible things happen to Nicole Kidman's character Grace, where she is repeatedly pretty much sexually assaulted throughout the film numerous times. And there's a part like where Tom comes and he's being nice to her, he's trying to like be there for her, he's trying to get her way out and things such as that, but he still has an expectation. He feels better about himself because he won't do what they've done, but at the end of the day he wants the same thing. He just does it to almost feel better about himself. And I think that sums him up to me pretty well as a character. Is he's no different than them. The only difference is he has like a level of shame that he won't pass.
So this is where I was getting stuck. So let's just say spoilers, because I think it's important to kind of talk about the movie as a whole, right?
Mhm.
Um, Generally, what good movie? Watch it if you can find it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a fascinating experiment, and I think it's not just a fascinating experiment; it's a good movie, so it's worth watching just for that.
Yeah, agreed. So everybody in the okay, so the Chuck. Speaking of Stellan Skarsgård, once every day or once a week or something. Oh, well, I guess we should say so. Nicole Kidman, in order to kind of earn her keep in the town, ends up doing small chores for each family, right? There's like 9 families or whatever, and she ends up doing like small things for each family. So that's how she kind of earns her keep in the town, right? And some of them pay her, some of them don't, but she becomes like a full-fledged sort of like employee of the town, basically, right?
She gets to do all the tedious jobs, like I'm trying to think of some, like watch these people's kids or wash these glasses, and
Yeah.
and she gets to the point where she's basically reprimanded on like one of them because they even explain that they purposely make the glass weaker and then doesn't get fussed at, but it's that type of like way somebody says something where it still feels like fussing when she breaks it, like she's treated like a child.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where she ends up.
Very condescending. Yeah, that's right. Um, and then there's the mafia family that she's associated with is like looking for her, and so she goes from missing person to wanted. And as she becomes wanted, the town turns, and you see them see like the town shifts from being a community that's like harboring her and like taking care of her to a community that's taking advantage of her, right? And they ask Tom Edison to deliver the news to her that they're going to pay her half and ask her to work twice as much, right? And she says, fine. So she starts doing that, and she's exhausted. So she starts to like make mistakes because she's exhausted. And throughout this whole process, there's just like no grace for her. Funny enough that her name is Grace. There's just like no grace for her. They get colder and colder towards her,
Yeah,
right?
she's dehumanized to a point, like
It's
where
dehumanized.
yeah, like to me it's that idea that people this weird entitlement almost to the town, where they have made it in a situation where they have done such a thing for her that she can't possibly really pay back, but they also hold all this power over her that she can't say no to anything. And this weird charity turns into entitlement of some sort, like she forever is enslaved to them, which I think is more appropriate when we talk about the second in this trilogy, but I think it fits here as well. Like she's essentially a slave to them in every sense of the word.
Yeah. So they think it's almost like subconsciously, it's almost like they're looking for a way to continue to dehumanize her. Even I don't know if it's I don't know that I could say unequivocally that they're thinking about it when she first gets there, but it's like as these opportunities keep coming up, they just jump on them, right?
Yeah,
Like,
I don't think their intentions were was negative when she first got there. I don't think there was this like long con here.
yeah,
But
yeah,
it's like crime. Crime is opportune moments. It's sometimes done. It's just as the opportunity arises, you just do it.
yeah. So things come to a head for her when Stellan Skarsgård, who she once a week or I don't know, once every couple of days or something, she goes down with him to the apple orchards and brings up some apples for them to sell. It's like one of the things they do in the community, right? Um, and so one of the days when she's down there, he takes advantage of her and I'm assuming rapes her. But one of the other townspeople just sees them basically having sex. And so they accuse her of seducing him or saying like, "I know you've always wanted him" or whatever. They twist it on her, and he doubles down on the story and says she's been trying to get after him for a while, and he didn't want to say anything out of honor for his wife and blah blah blah. So she finally has enough and tries to escape and organizes an escape with Tom Edison. But I can't tell if he's in on it or not. But the person who she leaves with, Ben Gazzara, who like drives the truck and she's going to escape town, he just basically brings her back to town
After raping her.
after raping her.
Yeah, we have to
He
make sure
uses
that's in there. She has to happen twice.
so he uses the escape as a way to say like, well, it's a little bit risky, like I need you to do this for me. And then he brings her back to town. So things are just like quickly descending for her. They put her in a they put her neck in a chain and tie her to the floor basically and give her enough leeway that she can sleep in her own bed. And then essentially for a period of about what 15 minutes in the movie or something or 10 minutes in the movie the town just like openly rapes her. Like no one's even trying to hide it at this point. She's just like tied to the bed and they're using her for sex.
Yeah, and I even some weird stuff like there's that kid who like wants wants her to spank him.
Yeah,
Like
right.
and it is such a wild scene because I was like, man, this kid is either going to be very comfortable with himself later or this is really going to fuck with him in real life. I'm not sure which one. But it's like it's a wild scene altogether. And of course it's used to where she can't win here. Either she does it and everybody does the same thing. They threaten her with it, and then they do it anyway. Like that point, he's like, "Well, I'll tell my mom this happened if you don't do it," and so she does it, and he tells her anyway.
He tells the mom anyway, right?
Just the same thing with the guy Ben. He says, "Hey, this is risky. I got to get my pay out of this," and then takes her back anyway.
That's right. She's stuck in every meaning of the word. Um, but here's the biggest question I had as the scene was going on. Well, okay, first of all, I guess in terms of movies that portray sexual assault, I don't think this one was as intense as other ones, right? It's not like we're watching Irreversible or something, right?
No, I think it, it's always tough to like do a tier list here. Like, which tier is this? But
Yeah, yeah,
it's done. Me and you have both seen this type of genre a lot. I think it's done more tastefully. I don't think it's gratuitous. I don't think it's excessive. I think it's part of the story. I think I think it's hard to argue. You got to justify, which we'll get to here in a minute. I'm sure you have to justify its end,
yeah.
and that is almost sadly a necessity if you want to justify its end.
You're watching the degradation and dehumanization of a woman, and it's tragic, but it's not done in a way where it's like overly negative and dramatic. It's kind of done in a very like matter of fact way, right? Like like here's a list of events that happened, and like we're still gonna have John Hurt, the narrator, come in and talk about what's going on. Like everything is done, I think, as just a more of like a like here's the next step in the story. Here's the next chapter in the story, right?
Yeah, and because it's got to increase every time of like how horrible her life is.
Right, exactly. So, okay, so then we get to so finally there's a point in the movie where um her I guess the way the movie kind of starts to come to an end. I'm trying to think, is there anything else we talk about before we get to this part? Um, oh,
I think yeah, I was like, I think you hit most of the main stuff.
interestingly enough, though, they do call a town hall, which is, I think, it's an interesting move for this community because she very openly talks about all the things that have been happening to her, and it's almost like it's a weird moment in the movie for me though because it's like she lays out everything that people have been doing, but they all know about it. So I don't really know what purpose the town hall serves other than to kind of call out what's in the shadows, maybe.
Yeah, I think from her end, it's almost like a last plea to like maybe they'll see because I think part of her still believes in like this small town care sort of thing. And it's like maybe if I show them, almost like you do children, you show them what they do wrong, they'll understand it. But I think to me, the main point of the movie is like from we'll talk about here in the end, how people justify their actions. And even when they're called out, they justify their actions
Yeah.
against all reasoning.
Yes. Um, but that but that's tested because the ending gets pretty nasty.
Yeah, and I think that's great at the end, which I guess we'll go ahead and just if this is really your last chance if you don't know the very end of this movie. Essentially, the town decides to call the gangster who's played by James Caan. At this point, they still have a chain on her. They have now locked her in and imprisoned her, and it comes to find out the gangsters looking for her are ran by her father. So they're not very appreciative of the way she's being treated as much as the town thought they would appreciate this gesture, so to speak.
Yeah.
Um, so from there, she goes to talk to her dad. They have a long discussion about how much they're both assholes. And she has
Yeah.
this moment where she's like, okay, I'm going to go out there. I'm going to forgive them. And he's like, what is wrong with you? Why would you forgive them? And, it's tough to, agree with the murderous gangster, but you're like, yeah, how can you? She walks out, she takes a moment, she gets back in and basically says, yeah, you can gun them all down
Yeah.
and and he burns the town down. And to me, that's the same thing as before. What she's doing, I mean, she's not only killing like people who directly did things to her, she kills the children, she kills everybody. The whole town burns to the ground.
Yeah, she's going scorched earth on Dogville.
Yeah, and probably like one of my favorite, like the coldest thing in the movie to me, as I kind of alluded to it earlier, where there's a scene where she has these figurines,
Yeah.
and the girl breaks them, and the whole thing is she said she'll stop doing it as long as she doesn't cry.
Yes.
And of course, Grace's character is very attached. That those figurines mean a lot to her, and so she does cry, and the woman just keeps like breaking the figurines. So as a twist at the end, there's a scene where he says, go to this family. She has kids. Start with the children and tell her she can make it stop if she doesn't cry. And it's so cold. It is like that is the coldest thing you could do. And but it's the same thing. Like part of even as the audience, you kind of feel like this is justified in its own like perverse way because
Yeah.
you've watched her. But at the same time, it's exactly what they did. You justify the bad
Yeah.
things that happen over and over again. You're like, somebody had to pay for this.
And they did. Um, Everything that was drawn out and everything that was happened to her like slowly and painfully was doubled down and acted upon that community like in a hurry, right? And just like instantly. And then they were wiped off the face of the earth. So I'm trying to figure out like I think the movie is fantastic in the way that it was made. I really love this movie. I'm trying to figure out what exactly the message is here. Like, what exactly is he trying to say? Because I don't think this is a movie about America, really.
No, I think it really feels like to me like that it has a more universal like human element to it. Like this is, the almost like this capability of like the evil people can be
Yeah,
and
that's what,
how they do it. And I mean, and it can come in such unlikely places.
I mean that's kind of where I was circling around. I was trying to figure maybe you agree with me then. Do you think this is somehow like just a look at sort of like the dark side of humanity?
Yeah, or at least in a very, like you kind of mentioned earlier, matter of fact, like that's kind of thing that makes this not feel as nihilistic. Is it's like these are things that happen to people. These are things that people do. These are the nicest people, your neighbors, everyone in small town America has somebody who's done horrible things. And I feel like that's just, it's not sitting there saying, we need to do better, or, we can't change. It's just like this is the way it is. Like there is such a matter of factness to everything, all the horrible things that happen throughout.
Right. Um, yeah, exactly. Um, but there's if you look at like the history of literature and then movies and stage plays, typically it's rare to see gangsters portrayed as like the good guys, right? Like that's
Yeah, like even when people talk about The Godfather, obviously the Corleone family, the protagonist, but they're not good people.
right.
Tony
Yeah.
Montana is not a good person, but he's the guy you root for in Scarface.
Sure, sure. Yeah, there's no question that they're doing bad things. Some directors like to play with that and like they make interesting characters out of it. But you end up rooting for Grace here, I think, and wanting her to get out of that horrible situation.
And you do kind of like when she gives the call that they can all go, and that the world would be a better place without Dogville. It's like you don't blame her. You don't even think she's wrong. You're like, yeah, these are pretty terrible people. Like these are awful people.
But here's what I like about Venture because I think he doesn't just leave it at the he doesn't just leave it at like a thought exercise. He doesn't just say like yes, it's worth it, and then kind of what some people would do is kind of show like in the background like flames burning the town or something like that, or maybe like people going to light the city on fire or the town on fire and then cut to credits or something. But he has that moment with Vera and the kids. He what does she do with Tom?
She
Uh,
kills him herself
she kills him, right? Yeah. And
because she
like,
tells him at the end, there's certain things you have to just do yourself, and he's like, you'll have to teach me that one.
yeah, that's right. And so like he holds the camera on these uncomfortable moments longer than most directors would. And I think it's specifically to elicit an emotional reaction. And I like how he does it. I think it's smart the way that he does it in a lot of his movies, but I like the way that he doesn't just let us get away with the thought of like, yeah, the town should suffer. Like he makes us suffer a bit with the town. To like,
Yeah, it's like you wanted this,
yes,
you wanted it, and this is what it looks like.
yeah,
Um, and one thing I thought was really impressive. There's a part where she's sitting in the car with her dad, and they ask him if he wants to pull back the curtains, and they have a discussion about that. And to me, it like felt a lot like what you see in like executions, where they eventually pull back the curtain and show the execution.
yeah, 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 yeah.
So that's what it really felt like to me, especially coming right after Dancer in the Dark. I
Yeah,
was yeah,
right.
I was like, I feel like this is almost like a motif you want to do is like this is it's an ugly ordeal. Like you can we get into a debate on like the death penalty, but it's like this idea that justice it doesn't always look pretty to somebody. If this is justice to her, it doesn't necessarily mean it's pretty.
Well, this reminds me a little bit. Have you seen the original Funny Games?
Yes.
Um, I mean, I guess any of them because they both do the same thing. But um, You know, one thing I like about what Hanukkah does there is he makes you complicit in all this violence when they turn and talk to the camera. Like, you know, all of a sudden they're like, ah, like look what we're doing here. Like kind of like drawing you in and making you like complicit in their actions. And as an audience member, you know, you're like, no, 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 I don't want to be part of this. Don't pull me into this. But by breaking the fourth wall there, I think he does a good job of kind of like pulling you in. Um, and it's how I felt here a little bit. There, you know, they didn't break the fourth wall, but like by just holding the camera there on the parts where she was assaulted, there's no doubt that that's hard to watch. But then we wanted her to have the justice, but he's like, okay, be careful what you ask for, right? Because then it's like, here it is. So I don't know. I don't think there's a lot of directors that will do that in that way. Um, and I guess I find it really effective. That's my whole point.
Yeah, and I think if there's one thing, and plus we're gonna get to some more rough stuff as the next couple episodes come up. But I think you have to have a director who's just willing to go all in. Like when you're gonna do something like this, I think there's plenty like you talk about that'll cut away, or they'll just like leave it as a linger, and it's like Von Trier is more no, 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 we're gonna go all the way. If we're doing
Yeah,
this, we're going all the way.
yeah,
And there's an appreciation that I understand. Like a lot of criticism is it's not subtle, but I also have the response to that is doesn't need to be. Like I'm not someone who cares all that much about subtlety, as long as it's not being preachy. Which I never find this movie preachy because I think it's done in this matter of fact style of this is it.
no, I think subtle is an interesting word though, right? Because subtle can be a good thing, but subtle can also mask the impact of something if you're trying to like downplay it for the sake of decency, right? And like the reality is like there's nothing decent happening here.
No, and I mean, I've always kind of used the thing that sometimes it's nice to have like a rubber mallet, but sometimes you really do need a sledgehammer
Yeah.
if you want to do something properly.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Exactly. So I don't have that much else to say about Dogville, I don't think, other than I mean, I just, you know, if I, stepping back and just talking, thinking through like Breaking the Waves, Dancer in the Dark, um, this. I know Europa was excellent, but I think Europa to me is almost like this weird outlier where it's like a really interesting movie, but it doesn't feel like a Von Trier movie almost. Um, but you know, one of the patterns that I think is interesting, he's been criticized a lot for this too. Like his characters just suffer. There's like so much suffering.
Oh
Uh,
yeah, and I mean, you especially you look at like Emily Watson.
yeah.
You look at her character. Um, look at the
Bjork.
characters here, and you look at Jork. I mean, it's like, oh yeah, this is a lot of suffering.
Yeah. And so far it's all been women, right? Emily Watson, Bjork, Nicole Kidman. They so he right around this time he started getting a lot of flack for basically getting like a hard on for watching women suffer. But looking back 20 years later, I just don't think that's totally fair.
No,
Um,
I would
Criticism.
say that if they weren't well written characters
Yeah,
or they didn't have depth to them, but typically those are the characters that have the most depth. They have the most like attention put to them,
yeah,
like, and that's kind of where I land with it. Like, yeah, is it kind of a like if you take that idea in a vacuum that he's made three movies like Breaking the Waves, Dancer in the Dark, and Dogville, and you've seen this like in a vacuum, this suffering. But I feel like there's always, and I think we talked about this a little bit last time. There's this weird hopefulness that kind of lingers around with this trauma. Um, we talked about it with the last two, especially, but this one's a little. Honestly, this is probably of the three the most like nihilistic, but it's still I don't think crosses that barrier. But it's definitely the most downer.
Oh, I think this movie's nihilistic. I'm trying to think of because we were as we were talking about breaking the waves, we were talking about how like basically there's this could be like sorry, I'm hesitating because I just remembered something interesting. So you know he actually is considers himself a born again Christian.
I did not know that.
Yeah. Apparently has a complicated relationship with the church, which
I can tell.
yeah. But I think our interpretation of Breaking the Wave seems to match how he is in his personal life, um, in terms of it being like a recreation of the Christ story almost. And then, you know, the beauty within Dancer in the Dark, although it's an incredibly painful film, is that she's doing something that she considers to be the sacrifice, right?
Right.
And from her perspective, like if you look at it as like a looking outwards into the story, it's you want her to make a different decision. It just seems like she's making the wrong decision at every turn. But from her perspective, she's doing everything towards a very like specific and beautiful end, right? But Dogville, I don't know.
It's almost questioning that idea of sacrifice in this one. Like Grace is sacrificing a lot,
Yeah.
but why? Like,
Why?
of course, we find out at the end. It's not like these gang. Like, yeah, it does talk about like, oh yeah, you shot at me, and her dad is like, yeah, that probably wasn't the way to go about it. But it's almost like she knows that. She knows he's not really gonna hurt her. At least that's kind of my interpretation. Is she never truly believed that.
Right.
So she's almost doing this out of spite and out of like pride. And me and my girlfriend made up that she was where she was watching it on and off. She's like, it'd be funny if she finally just says, you know what, none of this is worth it. I'm gonna go and like witness protection. And they said, don't worry, we have found you a great little small town to live in for your witness protection. And ends up being Dogville.
Oh, that would be an interesting twist.
But it's not what happened. Honestly, I like it worked out either way. But I just like that would be like a twisted sense of fate. But I think with this, she's almost putting herself through an unnecessary sacrifice where the other two, at least from their perspective, they felt like they had to do this.
Yeah.
Where she doesn't. I don't believe her I don't believe she's actually scared of her father that much.
Well, especially we'll learn more about that in the next movie, but looking at them as a series, yeah, no, certainly not, right? Okay. Uh, I feel like there's so much more I want to say on this movie, but I feel like that's a pretty good kind of general summary for me. Like I think it creates an interesting moral discussion because she's leaving a world that she doesn't want to be a part of because of the darkness in what she views as like the darkness in this gangster world, right? And she encounters like a wholly different level of darkness that really has no rules. Like at least in the world of her father, she kind of knows how to navigate it, right? But Dogville just has like no rules. It's like a completely lawless, chaotic society. So she ends up back in the one that she knows. Um, yeah, I don't know. Anyways, I think it's an excellent movie and one that it's like you said when you first started, surprisingly easy to watch, even though it's 3 hours long.
Yeah, like I'll be honest. I was like, man, why do we have to start with the 3 hour one? I was like, I don't know if I can do it, but yeah, it in my opinion. Of course, we're going to move on to the second one here in a second. I think it's the best of the three we're going to talk about today. But I do want to talk about the second one because from here, and it looks like it was done in the same year.
Yeah.
We can talk about the Five Obstructions, which is kind of I don't know, would this be count as a documentary? I was actually going to see if
Yeah.
you would, yeah, okay. So this is about Lars von Trier is challenging one of his famous directors, which is Jorgen Leth. I feel like that's how that goes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, the filmmaker behind a short film called The Perfect Human from 1967 to remake his classic short under circumstances of increasing constraint. And I'll kind of just go over my thoughts real quick because they're very simple. I think this is a really neat movie. I really enjoyed my time watching it. That's kind of where it ends for me. Like I think it's very neat. I think it's honestly kind of nice to see Von Trier be kind of geek out, like because he's talking to one of his favorite filmmakers. But yeah, it's not one I think I'll go back to a lot, but I definitely don't have any regrets on watching.
Yeah. Before I give my thoughts, and this has been as high as the 1097th best movie of all time.
Okay.
However, it has dropped. Now it's the 1927.
That's a
So
big drop. I'm kind of surprised. I actually kind of felt like this would be one that would slowly like increase over time.
yeah, I think, but you know, if you look at the where the biggest drop happened, it was last year, and I know that it was about 1,200, and then this last year it dropped basically 700 spots, and I think a lot of that was tied into the shoot pictures going out and trying to become more diverse and finding like just I forget the number, but a massive chunk of extra lists. And so there, as the list grows, you know, movies just shift a lot. This, I don't want to get too much into it. They shoot pictures, meta commentary here, but there's a lot of movies on this list that have like raised 3,000 points in a year or fallen, you know, 3,000 in a year. So I think there's a lot, the one from last year to this year just kind of, there's just a lot of shifting that went on. But anyways, okay. So to me, if you ever want to just get inside the head of Lars von Trier, I think this is the most honest portrayal of him as opposed to any interview that he's been a part of or panel discussion or like behind the scenes feature. I always get the feeling like he's performing.
I agree. I he even felt like I noticed during like a lot of the I guess those parts where he directed like the behind the scenes parts. I almost felt like he was humbled because from everything I've read and from the way he acted on there, he's very much a fan, and it's like meeting one of his idols.
Yeah.
And it didn't seem to go bad because I mean, it seemed like Leith, at least from what I've seen, seems to like him too. So it's like, oh, at least it wasn't one of those situations where you're like, wow, I wish I just never met him.
Yeah. No, they got along great. So I think I could be wrong. I think the J is like silent. So I think it's Jorgen.
Jorgen, okay.
Not to correct you, but
Oh
just for
no,
the
please do, please do.
if I say Jorgen, that's why I'm pretty sure it's how you say it.
Yeah, it
But
makes sense with like Johan and stuff. Yeah, that probably that makes sense.
yeah, that's right.
There's like a Y sound.
Yes, that's right.
Jorgen, okay.
Um, the interesting thing was like, you know, for all the movies that Von Trier would watch 20 times, I'm fascinated that it was like this short film called The Perfect Human. Because, you know, throughout the documentary, they would show glimpses of like the actual movie that
Mhm.
this was based off of. And like, I mean, it seems okay.
It seemed very Cocteau, and that's what I was like. Oh, when it first started showing, I'm like, Jesus Christ, is he going to be remaking a Cocteau film 5 times? I'm going to kill myself.
Yeah, you're right. It was very kind of maybe experimental, kind of
Yeah,
surreal. Um, uh, but it, you know, he makes the this incredibly like deep set of rules for Dogma 95, and then kind of immediately after two movies, basically just like doesn't pay attention. He creates his really strict boundaries for dance for Dogville in terms of like physically what can be there and how the set's going to be and all that. And then for this one, it's an entire documentary about rules, right? Like,
yeah. Should we? I guess I'm trying to think of the best way to go about this. Should we just go through like all 5 of them one at a time, or?
okay, sure. Do you have it up by chance?
I
Otherwise, I can.
do, I do, I do. So just in
Yeah, why don't you do
case.
it?
So we'll go through obstruction one. I is Leith must remake the film in Cuba with no set and no shot lasting longer than 12 frames, which for anyone who doesn't feel like doing the math, that's basically a edit every half second because frames are 24 frames a second. So he must answer the question posed in the original film. Leth successfully completes this task. So even on here, they tell you if he successfully did it or not. So essentially, yeah, he's got to remake the film in a place he's unfamiliar with a crew that he doesn't even speak the same language with, and he has to edit it in the most obnoxious way possible.
Before you go on, can we kind of quickly talk about the structure? So they sit in Von Trier's office, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they basically have this kind of like dialogue of trying to, as the movie goes on, it becomes more and more clear what Von Trier's goal is here. But at the beginning, he just says, I'd like to test you, basically, right? And I'd like, you know, I love this movie so much, and I'd just like to basically test you. and we have to kind of talk together and figure out challenges that would push you as a filmmaker, right? And so that's why they start to make these kind of rules.
And
So
yeah, it's nice because he lets him be part of like this because it is from somebody who seems to want to be challenged as well. Like he wants, like I think he's very fascinated in his own way. This isn't like an annoying thing to him.
yes, I
He's
agree.
like, yeah, like let's do it. I'll see what I can come up with.
He does really seem game, which is interesting.
Yeah, because I mean, basically, somebody's saying, "Hey, I love this piece of work, but I want you to remake it." And I think if you're kind of egotistical, you might take that the wrong way. But
Yeah,
I think it's something like this. You almost have to be open, and you have to sit there and analyze something you made at this point, like 30 years prior, like
yeah, yeah,
30 or
yeah.
40 years ago. Like it's a very fascinating thing to have to go back and say, okay, how do I redo this now that I'm older? And now I have these most arbitrary ways to remake it I can come up with.
The only other thing I quickly want to say on Leth before we move on is that so I don't know if you caught this or not, but in like reading on the movie, but for like 20 years or something, he was a sports commentator on TV as well.
Oh, I did not. That's awesome.
Yeah. So um, he, yeah, like he has this weird relationship with like the public in Denmark as well. And he got in trouble because he published an autobiography. And in his autobiography, he had like a very graphic account of basically sex with a 17-year-old um, that he had met like in his life. Uh, and anyways, people were like, "What the hell, man?" So that the controversy around that book actually got him kicked off of TV, and that would have been 2 years after this was made. So when this was made, he was still a commentator for sports on TV and had not published his book called The Imperfect Human.
I had no idea about that. No, I'm actually like kind of glancing at his Wikipedia page now because apparently he's a poet as well, which I guess makes sense. When I say Cocteau, I guess it really is very
Yeah,
similar.
very similar. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But anyways, so he's just a complicated sort of character, which I think, in not that von Trier or anybody knew anything about all this in 2003 when this was made, but it adds an interesting layer to this whole movie, I think, in retrospect,
Mhm.
right? Because he was one of the first people in Denmark publicly to get like canceled, basically, right? Like he, but it was because of his own like he published the book. People were like, you
I would
can't.
say, even Von Trier hadn't gotten himself canceled in Denmark yet. Like, man, you really have to go out there.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
really got to go full.
Exactly.
Um,
All right, sorry to interrupt you. So go ahead.
no, you're good.
So
So
they
yeah,
make
I
a
think
Hopkins video and they talk about the second obstruction, right?
yes, yeah. So they talk about that after the first one, and I mean, you won't probably hear us talk much about like the remakes in general. I don't even know if they actually ever show the full remakes in any of them. It seems like they just show like the
Just
idea because I think the original short is like 13 minutes long.
yeah,
So
yeah.
if they're remaking the whole thing, I don't think it is. So we'll move on. Essentially, this is probably the like even though the editing's weird, it's probably the closest to remaking the original film,
Yeah.
just on a budget. The second one, he must remake the film in the worst place in the world, which is up to him of what he considers the worst place in the world, but he is not allowed to show that place on screen. Additionally, he must play his role as the perfect man. The meal must be included, but the woman is not to be included. Lethry makes the film in the red light district of Mumbai. And so this one's really interesting. And the really what I want to bring up with this one is he ends up failing this challenge because he does end up like eating this like really expensive meal with these poor kids behind him. It's there to make him uncomfortable,
Yeah.
which I think is a really interesting thing to do when you're trying to challenge yourself is like you're there to make yourself as uncomfortable and really humiliate yourself in a sense,
Yeah.
but instead of blocking off the people he ends up making it a translucent screen. And I really loved when Von Trier was talking to him about this, that he failed it. He's like, yeah, I took what you said loosely. And he's like, look, I understand. this is probably a better film because you did this. But he's like, this isn't a film. This isn't a film contest. This is therapy. And I was like, I think that sums up what Von Trier sees out of filmmaking better than anything else. He's like, this is his
Yes.
own form of therapy.
Yeah, thank you. That's okay, great. I'm so glad you brought this up. So it's fascinating to see the way his mind works, right? Because he even says, I don't care if the movie's good or not. Like this is for therapy.
Yeah, and he even admits this is probably better than what you could have possibly done with what I
Yeah,
gave you. And it makes you think back to Dogville. It's like he purposely put these wild restrictions on himself, and he may have not even cared if it was a better film for it.
right.
It's just a challenge. I think he looks at filmmaking as a challenge.
Yeah. Yes.
Especially when they look at like Dogma 95 and you look at this and you look at Dogville, you're like, oh yeah, this guy just wants to see what he can do.
And I think the other thing before we get into the third obstruction, because this is when it starts to show a little bit. I think you see both an intense arrogance from Von Trier, but also a humanity that he knows what he's doing. Like he'll say things like, "I know this is diabolical what I'm asking you to do." So he knows what's like he's very acutely aware of like how people are going to respond and like what he's asking and like how much he's asking of people. So he's not without empathy. It's like I think he's able to kind of keep this on like an intellectual level, and so therefore it doesn't. It's like it's kind of you don't need empathy. It's just like this thought exercise. Well, what if we do it this way? Okay, what if you do right? And then he like wants people to kind of suffer for the art almost in a way.
Yeah, and it's always interesting because Leth goes and flies two different places. Of course, we know Von Trier will not fly anywhere, so he already knows he's asking a lot of him because this is something he's not really willing to do himself. But that's I don't know. I think that's what makes it part of it. It's this idea of like I'm going to ask you to do things I myself would not do, just to see if you do it. And
Right.
it's like asking somebody to go to name what they believe is the worst place on earth and then to show that place, which I mean, he tells him not to show it. So Left just decides to do that on his own. But at the same time, it's like, it's this idea of making something and admittedly on camera saying this is the worst place in the world. That can be kind of a tough thing to do because you're like, oh yeah, this is you know, these people who were probably not very well off are watching me eat a very expensive meal.
Well, it's just such an interesting thing too, because Mumbai has the highest number of billionaires per capita in the world,
Really, that's fascinating.
right? And but then like on the other, so they have this incredible wealth and then this complete poverty. It's like a one of the things that they're famous for, although that's a weird way to kind of phrase it. But um, yeah, for him to pick that place is sort of interesting because even people from Mumbai watching that would be like, hold on, it's not the worst place in the world. Like, you
It's
know,
got to be worse places, right?
yeah,
Like, that's what you're
uh,
hoping.
right. Um, okay, so what else does he challenge? You're right, though. He fails it, and he fails it specifically because Von Trier says that he didn't follow the rules.
Yeah, it's he kind of puts himself in a harder position because he could have done this just in a studio in Mumbai and he doesn't show it and nobody sees him do it. It's almost like he wanted to add like an additional like pain to this in a sense that he didn't have to add. But I think Von Trier is very going to be a very stickler because he likes to do that and he likes to torture
Yeah.
him at least a little bit. So on
Yeah.
the third one, because he failed, uh, he has two choices on the third one. And I think it's very fascinating that Left doesn't like these two choices. Both of these sound awful. So one of them is he can go repeat the second obstruction in Mumbai, but do it right. Or he can have free reign to do what he wants. And really the fascination there is he doesn't like either option.
Yeah.
Like the idea of not having any restrictions, not having any like guidance
Yeah.
is just as bad as having horrible guidance.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Um, I was intrigued that I was trying to figure out why he would hate it so much. And I guess the only thing I can think about is that it's like it's just almost like it kind of made me feel like I was back in class. If the teacher leaves like an open-ended assignment, you're like, well, but like what your brain just kind of goes like,
What do
how
you
am I
want
gonna?
me to do? Yeah, it's like, look, I can do anything, but I know you're looking for something.
Yes, like how can I get an A, right? And I think von Trier is saying like, don't worry about making an A. Like this is not what this is about. This is about like pushing yourself. But like that's such an uncomfortable place to be, especially as an artist.
Yeah, and other times, of course, I don't know what his situation was in '67. I'm sure he had restrictions he had, whether or not they were self-imposed or imposed by monetary or whatever when he originally made the short. This one, I assume Von Trier is footing the bill. So it's like, what do you want me to do? Because you're kind of the producer here. Like, and you're telling me
Okay.
just to do anything.
Oh, that's interesting. Like, how do I not disappoint you as the person who's basically funding this?
Yeah, and it's I think that at least for me, I think that would make me uncomfortable because at least with the rest of them, we're like, okay, there's only so many ways I can do this because you have given me such specific tasks that it's really more of a puzzle for me to figure out. Where there is no puzzle here. It's
Right.
just go do it. And it's either that or go back and relive some humiliation that you had before.
Yeah.
So it was an interesting one. I think they do show quite a bit of the short. I recognize one of the actors in it. He's a Czech guy. Funny enough, where I've been watching House, I saw him recently in that. But
Okay.
I can't remember the actor's name. It's Patrick something. But I don't really remember the short all that well. I don't know if you remember anything specific from it or not.
From the third one that he makes?
Yeah, yeah.
No, I wouldn't say so. The way that this was structured, I found myself getting impatient when they actually showed the product
Yeah, I was much more
because
interested in like their discussions.
yeah, exactly, yeah, exactly. Exactly. Um, so I'm trying to remember, he generally likes it, but then he says he's still trying too hard to make something good, right?
Yes, so he moves on to the fourth one, which is he must remake the film as a cartoon. And they both of them specifically state that they hate cartoons. and and I mean, I like Let There is just straight up. He's like, I am not going to learn how to do this. He's like, so I've got to do it in a sense of how can I do this without having to learn any technology, and how can I do it quickly. And of course, people familiar with animation are going to think rotoscoping. Rotoscoping is probably one of the cheapest and easiest ways to do animation.
Yeah, this is actually an interesting thing though, that I think I enjoyed about their relationship. So it would be easy to fall into the trap that Von Trier was in control here because he's sort of like guiding this and like making the determinations of what to do and the obstructions and like all this stuff. But I do really like when Leth pushes back.
Yeah, like he's like, look, I'm not gonna, I'm not gonna just take it. He gives his own thoughts. He's very honest. He's of what he will and will not do.
Yeah. Like the first one is I will not go back to Mumbai. I will not put them through that again. He says, I think he said like I think I would die if I went back there, or something like that, right?
Yep.
And then the second one is this cartoon. He's like, I will not learn how to like draw on cells and like he's like, I'm just not gonna do it. So I don't know how I'm gonna complete this challenge. So it's like an interesting thing where it's like he's accepting the challenge, but he's kind of processing out loud, just saying like, I am not gonna become an animator.
Yeah, and I think logically, rotoscoping was the best thing he could have done, and because he already had all the film. From what I could tell, like when he remade this one, he was using stuff from his other
Yes.
remakes, and
Yeah.
he was just
Yeah.
saying, "I'm not refilming anything. I will just use what I've already made."
Yeah. No, I think if I remember right, he even mentions that. I can't, maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, because I think he's worried that Von Trier is going to sit there and say it doesn't count. But he doesn't. He's actually very happy with how it turned out because he tells him straight up, he's like, this is not going to be good. And that's
Yeah.
okay. Do
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
worry about it being good. Just make it.
Yeah. Um, and I guess in the ultimate act of control, they get to the last obstruction, which is
Is Von Trier already made the fifth version, but he is going to credit Leth, and Leth must do the voiceover narration from his own perspective. Um, but it's actually written by Von Trier. So it is an interesting one. I feel like this is just more of the homage. It is the kind of I guess the only way to really end this in a satisfying way is to sit there and say, I'm not going to take any credit for this. It's yours.
Yeah.
Um, which is fascinating because it's almost weird to have this on a Von Trier set, because I understand why it is. Honestly, he's the guiding hand through this whole thing, but I don't think he's the credited director at all, unless it's just in the behind the scenes stuff.
Ooh, that's an interesting question. So there's two directors that are they're both technically credited as
Yeah,
directors. But yeah, like Von Trier probably directed the documentary, but the whole documentary is about Leth making a movie in five different ways, and he directed that. So it's like it's kind of gets complicated, but
well, it's kind of an interesting idea, right? Like, because in a sense, it's almost direction by proxy. Like when you look at like the first four, Von Trier is giving him these wild ways to do it that Leth would never do, and in a lot of ways, it's not his work. It's almost like directing by the proxy.
yes, yeah,
And then I think almost like Von Trier is thanking him by doing the opposite. It's like, look, I've already done the last one. I just got to get you to do one thing, and I'll credit you for it. You don't have to do a fifth one.
yeah.
And in itself, I mean, I wonder if like part of, because it is called Five Obstructions, so it's like, what's the obstruction here? And the obstruction may just be taking credit for something you didn't do.
Yeah, yeah. Um, my favorite bit of trivia about this movie was there was a rumor going around. I can't remember what year it was, but there was a rumor going around that Von Trier, that Scorsese really loved this idea, and Von Trier was in talks to remake Taxi Driver with the same obstructions.
That would be awesome. I would have loved that. Like, it would not have been good, but it would have been awesome.
I know, right? I think that rumor got dispelled, but I remember when that first came out, I got super excited. Um, yeah. Th- I think
Actually, I
I'm
just saw it because I'm going down. They take this for Wikipedia. It's Wikipedia, so take it with a grain of salt. I just used it to get the obstructions. But it was like in 2014, Paul Schrader, the screenwriter of Taxi Driver, said it would not be being made. Said it was a terrible idea, and in Marty's mind, if it never was something that should have been done. And I was like, of course, Schrader would have his opinion.
Schrader got involved. What's their connection? Wasn't Schrader the writer for Taxi Driver?
Oh yeah, I mean, think about every movie Schrader's ever directed. It's just Taxi Driver again. And I say that as someone who loves Schrader's work, but it's Lonely Man decides to do violence. It's every one of his works, and
Even Mishima, right?
yeah, even that. And then you look at even when he made the Exorcist prequel, it's the same thing. It's like,
Um,
dude, you really like this story, man.
funny, funny.
But I don't have a lot more to say on Five Obstructions. I think it's such a neat little experiment. I'm really glad I watched it, but I also don't. I think it's like, if you want to understand Von Trier, it's a good one to watch, because I think he is at his most honest here.
Yeah. I don't have anything. I think you nailed my feelings perfectly. That's exactly what I was going to say. So let's move on to one of his worst works.
Yeah, let's go on to that. So now we're going to be doing, I guess, he's had these trilogies, and and some of them we talked about. I really don't get how they're trilogies, but this is one that's actually a direct sequel to something he
Yeah.
made, which is Manderlay, which all the IMDb says is a story of slavery set in the southern U.S. in the 1930s. So I will do a little bit better. Essentially, after the events of Dogville, um, Grace has a like plastic surgery done or something and dyes her hair and changes her voice and ends up in basically Louisiana to, and I was so confused when I started this movie, and I was like, maybe it's where he's not American, because I was like, wait, they're driving these 1930s cars and they go to this plantation that still has slavery, and they're not making a big deal about this at first, and I'm like, slavery ended like 60 years ago.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what is this?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
they do explain it, that there is this plantation out in Louisiana that essentially slavery still going on. Grace, doing her best Lisa Simpson impression, decides to, try to free these slaves, and it kind of wacky things happen from there. The only thing I'm going to say before I get to there is I will give this a little bit of credit to where if I was going to sit there and be tasked with making a sequel to Dogville, this in no way would have been the idea I came up with.
True.
Like
True.
it is fascinating. Like it goes this route because it's like this almost feels like a different movie.
Yeah. Yeah.
But where does police say they do not have this in like the top 500?
No, in fact, it's quite far down. So this is the 7,242nd movie.
So this is one time I think I agree with Sight and Sound, and I don't agree with either the IMDb or the Letterboxd rating, which Letterboxd has like a 3.5 and IMDb has a 7.2. And I'm like, why? Like, maybe we can figure this out as we talk about it. I think this movie's like pretty terrible, all things considered. Like, it's got some interesting stuff in it, but I think it's kind of bad.
Um, okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just say it right out of the gate. This feels to me like a derivative work of Dogville made by somebody else.
Okay, so yeah, I came up like somebody saw it and said, "Yeah, I'm going to make a sequel to that."
Yeah. And it's
And
worse.
yeah, and it like even like the soundstage idea, which they kind of continue and they kind of I think the thing that bothers me in this is they want to use the soundstage idea, which is fine. It's Dogville, I understand, but it almost feels like they do it because they like Trier did it because he had to,
He
because it's the
says
only
it.
way. Yeah, does he?
He says that in an interview. He's like, I got a little tired of the idea, but I think there's something about sticking to it once you commit to it.
Yeah, and I mean, I kind of appreciate it, but at the same time, I almost felt like there were so many scenes where I'm like, you can tell he just wanted to do something a little bit more traditional, and he couldn't because he's stuck with this.
Yeah.
And it probably goes back to like we talk about Five Obstructions and Dogma 95, where it's putting these restrictions on yourself. And a lot of times it can pay off, but I think this is one of these examples where it doesn't. I don't think it's the sound stage is done in nearly as interesting of a way. I think the beginning with the U.S. map is kind of cool,
Yes.
and that's it. Even though I don't think New Mexico was a state at the point this movie takes place, but that's fine.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
I'd have to look it up, but I don't think New Mexico was a state yet. But
Oh,
either way, yeah, it's going through all this, and everything about it's just worse. Like I hate to say because I love Willem Dafoe, but his character feels so different than James Caan's, and then I don't even think Grace feels like the same character.
no.
Like she feels like I just don't imagine the Grace from the first movie getting caught up in this. Like,
No.
and I don't get it. I don't get. I get what they're trying. Like I feel like the theme of the movie is playing supersedent into the good story, which I've talked about plenty of times on here. Annoys me when they do that in movies. It's like, like Dogville is a good, interesting movie that also has good thematic elements. I'm interested in the thematic elements because it has a good story with it.
Yeah. Yes. Oh God, this freaking movie, man. Okay, I'm trying to think of how to start talking about it. So, also like, also like Dogville, this is broken up into chapters. I think this one is eight instead of nine.
Yes.
And essentially, it tells the story of Grace going to a plantation that has slavery still. By coincidence, Lauren Bacall, who's also in this movie, she plays the plantation owner. She goes by Ma'am. She dies. Well, I guess it's worth saying that they kind of stumble upon this. Like they stop to rest or something, and then while they're stopping, a woman runs out and says, "Help! They're gonna cane um, Timothy." She's like, "What are you talking about? What does that mean?" And she goes in and she sees a white family whipping a black man, and she's like, "Wait, what?" Um, and so as she learns about what's happening, she's like, "I gotta stay," and her dad leaves, but the family, her protection leaves, but he leaves her behind with what, like seven. Uh, the way they talk about it is it's almost like an inheritance she has or something. I don't quite understand it, but essentially he leaves her with like seven or eight henchmen to like help her out, right?
Yeah, one of them being a contract dude, like, which is one of the funniest bits in there. He's like, I have never needed him, but I might. And I'm like, okay, and Defoe is great in that part, but yeah,
Yeah.
it definitely doesn't feel like it's something James Caan would have said if he was recast.
Right. Yeah, that's true. It has a little bit more of like a humor to it. Um, so she starts she obviously like one of her big reasons there is to make sure everybody knows that they're free. And then she kind of takes it upon herself, similar to Dogville, where she commits herself to like serving this community and like winning their hearts by like being a servant leader. She commits here to like teaching them how to be free, right? So she teaches them about democracy. She teaches them about like profit sharing, and
If
she
you want to
sort
see an actual white savior complex story, here it is.
that you nailed it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this is it. Like, if you hear somebody say Dance with Wolves is, maybe they have an argument, but this is a better example.
And it just gets worse in that white savior idea. Like he
And I feel like
really,
it's the point. Like, I feel like it's being criticized, but like,
yeah,
there's times where I'm like, this is so close. Like, I kind of give him credit because it's like, if you cross the wrong line, this just turns into racism. And being able to balance that and not really care about being offensive to get an idea of cross is like admirable in its own way. But it's also like I'd watch it and be like, is that racist? I think it is.
so who toes this line better, Tarantino or Von Trier?
I was actually I'm glad you brought up Tarantino. I want to get your thoughts about this. I,
Okay.
so apparently Tarantino is a huge fan of Dogville. So I have to assume he has seen this movie.
Okay.
I think Danny Glover's character was direct inspiration for Steven in Django Unchained.
Yeah, I'm good with that comment.
Yeah, like I can't really, I'm not gonna spoil it all yet, but it's like, oh, this is Steven from Django basically, but less over the top evil.
Especially knowing like how many films Tarantino watches every day.
Yeah,
Like 100% he saw this, right?
yeah, especially if you because he sat there and made comments like Dogville would have won so many awards if it was a stage play, which part of me is like, I think it loses something if it actually is just a stage play. Like I think it actually works better as a film because it's so unfilm like.
Yeah.
But he's the one making movies, so what do I know? But
Yeah.
but yeah, and I mean, especially like when you get John Hurt to be dropping like the N word like several times in a sentence, you're like, this is a real movie that I'm currently watching. Like this almost feels like an SNL sketch.
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting angle. Kind of, yeah.
It's like let me get this like have you ever watched Documentary Now? Like that it's a fake documentary
Yeah,
series
yeah,
where they
yeah,
have
yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
and it's I think part of the humor is getting somebody like Helen Mirren to say things like batshit Valley in the most serious deadpan voice you can get.
Ugh,
And I feel like that's part of the humor in this, and I don't know if it's intentional.
I don't think it is, and this is one of my criticisms of the film. Like, I know that Von Trier has a trollish sense of humor, but I I don't think he meant to like troll something this sensitive. I don't. It's possible.
And you just sit there and you're like, because I'm going to get, obviously I give him the benefit of the doubt. We've talked about it. I think he is a very empathetic person. I think he is trying to talk about interesting ideas with this movie, but I think this is one of those times he's out of his depth because he's talking about a particularly American history problem that we deal with even today. And he has no idea how to navigate it. He has zero clue. We don't even know how to navigate it half the time. But like he definitely doesn't know how. Like it's not as universal. Like the issues he's talking about are very American centric in a lot of ways,
Yeah.
or at least very Western centric.
No, I mean he chose one of the most difficult points in American history, complicated parts in American history.
Yeah,
And
and he's coming at it. It's cool. Like I think the idea of coming at it from an outside perspective can be very valuable.
yes.
But I just don't get any value out of this. It's like, yeah, these are the same debates I've heard my whole life. Like, you know, this always sucks to talk about, but it's like, they get through a whole part of the film where it's like this idea of whether actually freeing them like they were was the best way. And that is a complicated historical thing to go through because the right thing in a vacuum is, people shouldn't be slaves. I don't think that's a hot take here. I hope that's not a hot take here. But but the idea of how it was done, that nuance is, an interesting conversation that's still heavily debated. And I don't know if he knew how to like really navigate that well enough. Like, I know what he's trying to sit there and say. Like, it's still white people's problem of how they handled it, even when they were doing something nice or they were doing something they were supposed to have already done.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
still didn't do it correctly, and you still caused a lot of problems because of it. Which I mean, I don't know if you disagree. I feel like that's the whole point of the film, is saying, yeah, even when you do the right thing, you do it the wrong way. It leads to just as many problems.
So I have a theory about this movie.
Okay.
I think this is a critique on the British Empire.
I mean, I'm always for, dunking on the Brits, so let's hear it. I'm all for it.
Because the arguments that are used, so can we say from this point on, spoilers?
Yeah, because I don't really think this is like quite as intense as spoilers. Like, the only real revelation, spoiler alert, is that Danny Glover's character helped write the book on the laws and helped be part of the reason they continued to be enslaved.
Yeah, like he
It's like
knew,
their own. That's the big reveal, and it's not even that big of a reveal.
like he knew that slaves were free, and him and Ma'am, who was the woman that died in the beginning of the movie, got together and said it's not fair to put the folks that are on the plantation, it's not fair to just release them out into the world. They're not ready for it. So they created a set of laws that, although they were strict, each one of them was done from a place of empathy. Like, there's going to be a point in the day when they can have like a free time. And that just happened to coincide with the time that the shade was over in a particular area so they could be cool and like not be in the sun, right? Or like they were going to be fed at a certain time, or like whatever. So it was the way that it was portrayed in the movie was, I think, from that Danny Glover was doing his best in difficult circumstances to create situations that would make them comfortable, right? Now, the only other place I've heard that argument is the British Empire justifying everything they did in wherever they went to, right?
We're
Yes,
helping the savages.
we're helping the savages. That's it.
Bringing Christianity to those who need it.
Roads, schools, infrastructure. Like the argument is that you're better with us here, right?
Yeah, we have the resources to help you.
Yeah. And the problem with that, I mean, I'm sure there's many that I haven't even thought of, and absolutely not qualified to talk about this in a nuanced way, but I know one of the immediate problems with that is like by doing that, you're not allowing a culture or a people to progress and learn in the way that they need to, generation over generation, to get to that same place of power and authority that the British had, right?
Right.
Like it's interesting right now if you take a step back, one of the I'll also just briefly mention, since I mentioned her name earlier, Holly's one of the best kind of minds around investing. She's just a super amazing researcher, and we've been talking about investing in the Indian stock market of all things, because if you look over the past like 10 years, it's been the highest performing stock market in the world. And it's like this little known secret of people that are in India that like it's better than investing in the US stock market. You go invest in the Indian stock market and you get a better return, right? This is less than 100 years after they were freed from the British, right?
Right.
There's 2 billion people in India. Like, there's a lot of arguments that it shouldn't even be one country, but all of that kind of stuff aside, like, they're doing a good job with their country. They don't need the British. Like, are there problems? Sure, but like they're solving that on their way, right? And like that's important that you solve it your way.
Yeah, and I mean, there's an argument there that they reverted back to the culture they've always had, or maybe not reverted, just could be more open about it and reject a lot of like Western influence. Where the U.S., it's a lot more British implants. Like, a lot of people here have British ancestry or at least European ancestry. So the culture didn't even need to change that much. India is in a position where they had, a lot of things had to change. The US had to like develop their own government, but at the end of the day, it was people who were from British ancestry saying, we don't want actual British people here.
Right, right,
You can
right.
leave.
Yeah. And they were able to lean on history to do it, right? There's a lot of Roman influence and like a lot of British influence for sure. And like they were able to kind of go back into history and like pick and choose the part that they liked, right?
Mm.
Yeah, and I guess see this is the thing. I'm just he just chose an incredibly difficult topic, right? And the idea that Grace gets to just leave when she wants to leave adds another level of complexity to this, right? Because it's like D Danny Glover and Lauren Bacall had this mm, extremely, I don't even know what the word is, just complicated view on what they thought was best for the people that had been slaves um, on that land. Um, but they didn't, and they thought they were taking care of them in a way, but that's still not really enough of an excuse because they weren't fixing the homes, they weren't giving them money, right? So they still weren't giving them a chance. It was like their lives were not improving, right? It was this super half-hearted like way of people keeping people down, but like being nice to them, right? Um, and they not and I guess the most important thing is just not giving them agency, which is the whole point of like slavery versus not slavery. It's like you
Mm.
just want agency in your own life, right?
Right.
Um, but then she just gets to leave, like when things get tough.
Yeah, she gets to make the choice that, hey, I'm out of here.
Yeah. So, she's just coming from a position of strength and power and privilege and all those things. Like it just becomes too complicated for her and she just gets to go.
Yeah.
And nobody else has that choice on that farm, right? Or that plantation, whatever. And I think, that again, like kind of going back to the British Empire thing, if it's not a film about the British Empire and it's just about the US, I don't know why he needs to make this movie, other than to kind of put a character in an extremely complicated, if we're thinking about him as somebody who likes to explore a lot of nuance and have like complicated moral discussion, right? Um, okay, that's one thing. But I don't know why he needs to make this movie unless it's a metaphor for something, because he doesn't say anything new on the topic of slavery. Like he doesn't say anything new on the complicated aspects of American history. Like it might be interesting to him, but like certainly for Americans, there's nothing. I don't think you watch this and like learn anything.
No, I can't imagine anybody got anything new out of some of these old debates. Like, it's not to sit there and say they're not worth talking about or not worth saying, but I also just don't know if he had much to add. Like, and especially because it's in like such an unrealistic situation where, like the confusion happens because it's almost like he wants to tell the slavery story, but he's making like a sequel to Dogville. So he has to make up this outrageous scenario of where there's this plantation that's still doing slavery 70 years after the fact, which can kind of be its own cool concept, but I don't know if it's like, I don't know. I don't know how you mesh those two ideas together, a sequel to Dogville and this almost strange little story.
Yeah. Yeah, it would be interesting. I do feel like one thing that was successful here, if we're thinking about this as a second part of a trilogy that never happened, the world did open up a little bit here, right? You got to see her
Mm-hmm.
traveling across country. You got to meet her dad a little more. You got to see more of that relationship. Um, So it would have been interesting to maybe see this as a part of a trilogy, but
Yeah.
without that, we don't really get that, right? So we just have two standalone films. I think Dogville's a masterpiece, and I think this one, for the most part, just kind of sucks as like a from a filmmaking perspective. And I think the writing is really bad, which is interesting because he was the sole credited writer on this. Um, in a lot of his best movies, he had a co-writer.
Yeah.
So I don't know what that means, but um, this movie was not good, I don't think.
I tried to see, did Dogville have two writers? No, he was the only one on Dogville. But yeah, I did notice that on some of the other ones, there was usually another writer.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so if there's one you want to skip, is to people listening, this is probably one worth skipping, in my opinion. I'm actually surprised at some of the higher ratings it has because I don't know, maybe we missed something, but I didn't find anything all that interesting to grab onto, like a lot of his other stuff. Like I feel like even with like Epidemic and The Idiots, I felt like there was more to talk about.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I'm good with that too. I think that you could at least see like what his brain was trying to do, or there's something interesting going on there. But this one just felt like a failed experiment, which I mean, I guess taken as a total of all of his projects, he has more hits than misses. And that's the whole point of experimenting, right? Is that some of them don't land. I think this one just didn't land.
Yeah, and I wonder sometimes if maybe he felt the same way, and it's why he's put off like Washington for so long. Is maybe he's wondering if there's a point because obviously he was interested in something because he did Dogville, and then we talked about he apparently had a pilot episode for I don't know maybe a TV show or something that I don't think took off, and
Yeah.
then he did the sequel to this a couple years after that, and I mean it's kind of weird to do all this stuff within like 2 years, and now it's been 20, almost 20
Well,
years now.
the script for George Washington's done, according to people that were like working on it.
So it's just doing it sort of thing.
Mhm. Yeah.
Interesting.
There's some speculation because he's announced that he's working on a new project. He's gonna try to make another movie before his Parkinson's gets out of control.
Mhm.
So there's some speculation it'll be George Washington since the script's already done. We'll see.
I mean, I would still be interested if they did a third one. I would definitely watch it. But
Sure.
yeah, it's just interesting for him to do so much work with it in the early 2010, the 2000s, and then that's it. Because and I guess that's a good time to segue into what he does after this because he kind of leaves all the Dogville stuff behind. For our next three ones, we should have we're finalizing right now, but we should have a special guest in for this episode where we'll be talking about a very odd trilogy, I guess, where we start with The Boss of It All from 2006, Antichrist, which is probably, I don't know, maybe his most infamous, arguably, from 2009, and then Melancholia, which is Chris's favorite from 2011.
Yeah, I can't wait to watch it again and see if it hits me better. Because man, reading online, people love Melancholia, so I'm very curious to see what I missed the first time. I do not like it.
I find it interesting because it's IMDb. Take it with a grain of salt. I find it interesting that most of his works have a 7 or 8 in them. Antichrist is probably one of the few that is probably one of his lowest, if not his actual lowest, film rated. And I just wonder if part of that is a lot of people who weren't familiar with Von Trier started
Yeah.
watch that movie, and they just had no idea what to expect. Because I feel like from my memory, it's not that much different from what he's done at this point.
Okay. Yeah, I'd be curious. I've heard that it has the most optimistic ending of any of his movies, so I'm super
Man,
interested.
it might be, but that's whew, maybe. We'll see. I'll be glad to rewatch. I haven't seen this. I watched this, and I'll be honest, this was my introduction to Von Trier because I did a thing in college, as I think I've mentioned before, where me and my friend sat down like for a whole week and watched a list of most disturbing films ever made.
Yeah, yeah.
And I rented this from the library, and yeah, it was a good one to like fuck up your week. So it'd be really exciting to talk about that. Hopefully, we can get somebody to be tortured with us for the week. So until next time, I appreciate everybody listening.
Awesome. Thanks, Zach. And thanks everyone for listening.